cybernetics, it turns out, is a lot of things, and it can be something as abstract as artificial intelligence. But the funny thing about it is, when you start thinking artificial intelligence, you're actually thinking at the same time human being. And so it turns out that cybernetics, while it came from largely from circuit diagrams used during the Second World War, and it also came from mathematical speculations about propositional logic and how our brains might be like computers, it also became increasingly a sort of social science. That is, it paid attention to human behavior, and it tried to create models of human behavior, and of course to create machines into which humans could be inserted. This is the great, I think it's the great social science of post-war America, the one that got built the most. So I'm going to actually look at cybernetics in its aspect of a kind of functional structure, as providing functional structures for human-machine interrelations. And I'm also going to look at some aesthetic, intellectual, and political strategies that were developed to at least grapple with, if not directly oppose, the kind of structures that were being imposed upon the world gradually through the course of time from the end of the Second World War through, say, the 70s. So the aesthetic strategies I'll be talking about mostly have to do with Deleuze and Watari. Their very famous book, 1,000 Plateaus, their earlier book, The Anti-Oedipus, and then some of Felix Guattari's late work. How many of you know something about Deleuze and Guattari, 1,000 Plateaus? Oh, fantastic. So you're going to be introduced to two super interesting things that people don't actually put together. So this is a hypothesis. What I'm going to suggest here is absolutely something that I think is quite new that I'm working on to not only to publish articles, but also to try and find ways to think about organizing people and creating events, in fact. And you'll see at the end that all of this very theoretical stuff is really event-oriented and also human-oriented, believe it or not. So the title is Escape the Overcode, Guattari's Schizoanalytic Cartographies, or the Pathic Core at the Heart of Cybernetics. I'm going to explain what that all means, and I will get to Guattari's last book, or his most important book of his, the end of his life in the late 80s it was actually, which is called Schizoanalytic Cartography. But first I want to explain this idea of overcoding, because there's no reason you should know what it means. So a definition has been written here by one of the many fanatics of the book 1,000 Plateaus. And so it shows that overcoding is the overriding of something heterogeneous, different ways of expression, different forms of speech, different uses of language or even symbolic logic, in order to produce a unified substance. Let's forget that other part. The phenomenon of constituting an overcoding, it produces phenomena of centering, unification, totalization, integration, hierarchization, and finalization. In other words, overcoding is when a structure is imposed on you. And in Deleuze and Guattari's mind, because these are leftists, they're people who really created their great work in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, for them, the ultimate overcoding is always capitalist. It's the state as an expression of capitalist social relations that realigns every kind of singular expression or every sort of bifurcation in the world according to an axiomatic principle, which is make profit, reinvest, make profit, reinvest, the basic idea of capitalism. So ultimately, overcoding goes back to that, and when I use the word escape in the title, it's the question of escaping from something like the grip of what, as we will see, is ultimately not just a code, but a machine. And so you see a machine here, and I'll get back to this machine in a moment. What I'm going to do to launch this whole discussion on machines and take you someplace which I'm sure you have never been, because this is kind of a rare thing that I'm going to show you, something people don't look at. I'm going to raise a little bit of a question about how people in the French vanguards from, say, the beginning of the early 20th century onwards had thoughts and created expressions, aesthetic expressions around what you could call deviant machines, or even self-derailing machines. Machines that do not constitute or formalize in any way an act of overcoding, but rather which tend to transform themselves and even break themselves up so that they don't impose too much upon people. So this is a funny kind of machine, and it's actually discussed quite a lot by a French critic named Michel Carouge in a book which as you can see is called Les Machines Célibataires, which would translate as the bachelor machines. And you see, in fact, Duchamp's famous large glass traced in an outline on the cover of this book. So, bachelor machines. This is actually an aesthetic idea, a literary idea, first of all. Duchamp, of course, was a very literary artist. There are also various French writers, such as Raymond Roussel, perhaps the most famous of them all, who created in his his book called Phantom Africa, literary descriptions which actually take a great effort from the imagination to actually see what he's describing, because it goes on for pages and pages, and it turns out to be the most complicated sort of a machine you can imagine. In fact, the very fact of imagining it already creates sort of something new in one's life, as I discovered when I read these books. It's a very, very strange sort of an aesthetic, which seems to be registering the continual increase of machines in our lives, but at the same time creating abstract machines which have very little to do with the familiar machines that we know. So I'll show you a little bit what's in Michel Carouge's book. Immediately he shows pictures of machines, quite different sorts of machines. And the third one I found quite astonishing, that he should put that in there. The book was published first in '59 and reissued in '75. So he had seen The Man on the Moon. Later, towards the end, you get kind of Dogon masks and totem poles in this book. But what he says right here is very interesting. He says, the Dogon masks and the totem poles will lead us to understand how mechanical or machinic figurations in painting and in science fiction have become the new masks of mankind on the path toward mechanization, or in the process of mechanization. So there's what he's interested in is this relation between man and machine, and trying to create some kinds of masks or fictions which express the ambiguous reality of people becoming more and more involved with machines, to the point where machines start to actually form part of one's daily rhythm. So he has an idea behind his head which is manifested pretty quickly in the book. He talks first about a kind of myth of machines, and he describes it as an operation of mental dioptrics, or in other words, of creating an apparatus of vision in your head. The myth creates a machine of vision in your head. And he says, using the kind of anthropological language of the time, its fundamental invariant is the distance or difference between two separate realities which it brings together in its vision. Thus, the fundamental invariant of the myth of the bachelor machines is the distance or difference between the machine and human solitude. So we have the idea of a mythic machine that would have this proximity and then distance or difference. But then comes the really interesting thing that he says the group, the transformer group, and this is an idea he seems to be inventing, the transformer group of a myth is produced by the refraction of this vision during the automatic crossing of different environments, fields of consciousness, of unconsciousness, and representations. From that, in particular, arise the metamorphoses of the bachelor machines when they are projected in a series of different perspectives, sexual, penal, criminal, pathological, sporty, artistic, theatrical, anticipative, and in various sorts of staging, initiatory stagings that finally all converge on each other. He concludes by saying, through its system of mobile or moving images, the myth is a mental machine which is used to capture, transform, and communicate the movements of the mind. Clearly, this guy has an idea that a machine, even just the concept of a machine, can be a model for transformative activities when that concept is projected into a reality. And this is kind of what artists do. They take a concept, an abstract one, they project it in a reality that's already there, maybe a moving reality, and they use that to change the characteristics of this reality. Well, that's what we're going to see increasingly as this talk goes on. First, one of the machines that Michel Carouge talks about, it's Franz Kafka's penal colony, and an artist here has given us a representation of the machine which, you know, this is a prisoner who has refused to obey a commandment. In fact, the commandment he has refused to obey is honor your superiors. And so he's condemned to be placed on the lower bed, or so-called harrow, of this machine, while the upper harrow descends on his body and is going to inscribe in his flesh the letters of the law that he has not respected. In other words, respect your superiors. And to do that, an operator of the machine will give it a drawing, which apparently the inventor, according to Kafka, the inventor of the machine had drawn, and it is this drawing which will serve as the template for the writing of the sentence on the back of the condemned man. So there's a relation there between a template and then the activity of this machine, which itself is clearly a subjectifying activity, an activity that transforms you in your very flesh, and indeed takes the model or the template in the drawing and transfers it into your flesh, imposes it on your flesh. So if there was any sort of overcoding ever to be done anywhere, this would be the place. That thing is actually called the draftsman, according to Kafka, the part that...
Wasn't it called the herald, the bed, and the designer?
Sorry?
The herald, the bed, and the designer, I think.
The who put that in the designer?
The herald, the bed, and the designer.
Yeah, exactly. The designer it's translated as. Ah, very good, yeah. Yeah, the harrow, the bed, and the designer.
That's how the translation that I read where it was.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I'm sure it is. I was reading it in French, so I didn't have the...
Yeah, it's different now in the English.
Yeah, designer, that's better than draftsman. Yeah, very great. Well, here's another machine. This one is Duchamp Machine. And he points out that it also has two sections. And among many other things that one can say about Duchamp's glass, because this can go on forever, I mean, among the very interesting comment that Duchamp said when he said that just as a photograph can take a three-dimensional reality and project it into two dimensions, so a machine is actually a four-dimensional reality, in other words, a reality in time, projected into three dimensions, a potentially mobile object. So that's the way he conceived his glass, actually, as a kind of a four-dimensional creation that had been projected for our minds on this sculptural thing of the large glass. And Carouge points out in a very interesting way that these three sort of sheets up here, which could be the spots where the design goes into the designer in Kafka's machine, where the whole question of the design is absolutely fixed once and for all. These spots seem to be empty, and Carouge's idea is that they're basically waiting for the materials, the many different kinds of written materials, patterns, instructions, and so on, that you find in the green box. This being an example, apparently, of the green box as it was sold as an edition. So that's the glass, I guess, itself somehow, if it's not its copy somewhere. The point of all this is to say that there's an underlying aesthetic of machinism in France particularly from the turn of the century, even the late 19th century onward. I mean, there's L'Autrement talking about a sewing machine and you know, an umbrella on an operating table or something like that. I mean, the machine in the French avant-garde imagination is very, very strong. But that's kind of an undercurrent that I think is interesting when you approach the second half of the 20th century. And it explains a lot, for instance, about this strange thing that this guy named Landau, in this book, Hypertext, The Convergence of Contemporary Critical Theory and High Technology, which was published in 1992, explains as something kind of surprising that when designers of computer software examine the pages of a book like Glas, this is Derrida's book, which I have a page of up there, or of grammatology, they encounter a digitalized, hypertextualized Derrida. And when literary theorists examine literary machines, from which this drawing here is taken by Ted Nelson, they encounter a deconstructionist or post-structuralist Nelson. These shocks of recognition can occur because over the past several decades, literary theory and computer hypertext, apparently unconnected areas of inquiry, have increasingly merged. This is something I actually noticed in the late 90s. It was very surprising for me, and nobody seemed to say, why have these things merged? Why should something apparently as far apart as software design and literary theory have anything to do with each other at all? Well, that actually is, the answer to that is basically the history of cybernetics itself. So we could start that history, I think. There's two places to start it. One is with the notion of neural nets, which is actually a hypothesis, a scientific hypothesis by McCulloch and Pitts. That probably should be an H there, McCulloch. In 1943, they supposed that the structure of the brain could be annotated like this, that there would be, that the neurons of the brain would configure a kind of a logical computer, or actually propositional computer. And they invented this notation which, despite what it looks like, actually reads this way. These are neurons which are received by another neuron and which condition the way it fires, actually condition what's going to happen. So this is read like this, and this is supposed to explain to us that our brain is very like a computer, or at least that we can imagine it according to the way that Turing, the great early theorist of computers, imagined a computer. So here you see a little closer a McCulloch neuron, what it looks like. Notice that it says output on the bottom, input fibers coming from other nerves on the top. If you put a bunch of those together, McCulloch and Pitts thought you had the model at once for a computer and a brain at the same time. And this is what's been used a lot in artificial intelligence experiments. 1943, before that, Turing had come up with this idea. Are you familiar with the concept of a Turing machine? Any of you?
Turing machine?
Turing. This guy, Turing, an English guy who was a brilliant mathematician and also very good with code, and whom the British, for the British war effort, he was assigned to the code section, and he did brilliant things which allowed both the decoding of German messages and encoding of British military messages. But while the guy was a genius, and while doing that and many other things, he started to think some very basic things about what a machine could do. And at a time when there were no digital computers, only analog machines at this point, he started to think of a machine that wouldn't be designed just to do one kind of operation, like open the door or maybe count how many balls fall through a hole or something like that. He decided to design a machine that could do any operation whatsoever. And he started by imagining what that machine would be. And it's written here. You may have read it. It's basically a machine itself, which at any time is in a state, which is one among a finite number of states. There's also a linear tape, which goes infinitely in both directions. The machine is here. The tape extends infinitely. And what the machine can do is it has a head for reading and then either writing or erasing. So the head, when it's placed before a particular square on the tape, can scan the square and find out whether there's a mark on there,
It can erase a mark in case it finds one inscribed there, and it can inscribe a mark if the square is empty. It can also change position by one and only one square at a time, either to the right or to the left. This is like a conjecture, right? This posits an infinite computer, before any such computer even exists. This is an abstract machine, which has had a tremendous force, because from it have flowed not only computers themselves, but also the idea that man and computer are somehow the same, and that you can think both of them at the same time. Therefore, it's really this hypothesis which gives rise to the first model of a mechanization of the mind, which is this notation that's used by McCulloch and Pitts and other scientists for decades, actually. And maybe it's even still being used, I don't know. So in this case, they're trying to show how the eye works, how the nerves in the eye are connected. No one, at the time, no one knew whether the neurons were really like that, and the inventors of the model didn't think they were either. They said, we're inventing a mathematical model. The inside of the brain is probably something like this. There are probably elements we don't know, but we're going to develop this mathematical model and apply it, as I said, continuously at the same time, both to human beings and to symbolic logic, which is increasingly programmable on computers. Actually, in 1943, it wasn't increasingly because the digital computer hadn't been invented yet, but it was on the edge of becoming, after that it would go fast. So here's the other origins of cybernetics in electrical engineering. Norbert Wiener worked in the war effort as well, but rather than working on code as Turing did, he worked on electrical circuits in anti-aircraft guns. He had done that actually earlier, and then he worked on the theory which would allow those anti-aircraft guns to have automatic parts that would help the gun find a plane faster than any human being can do it. And these kind of machines set up so that the human being is actually helping the machine. The human being can do some things, not all things. It can do some things completely wrong and shouldn't do those. The machine is actually setting the environment and the parameters within which the human being is going to work. So a lot of this kind of engineering was about finding the place for the person in a complex system. And this guy here, Claude Shannon, was essential to getting those complex systems in place. You've heard about him. I think he invented, really quantified the theory of mathematical theory of information. If you don't know who Claude Shannon is and you don't know who Norbert Wiener is, it's really interesting to find out because these are fundamental math scientists for the things that you're dealing with to the extent that you're dealing with new media. These guys are fundamental. But something that we didn't know for a long, long time was that these theories have been so prestigious that far away in a country like France, critics who seem to have nothing to do with this stuff were actually influenced by these theories, and what we call the structuralists actually, so in particular, this tribe up here, Jacques Lacan, Claude Lévi-Strauss, and Roland Barthes, were actually very much influenced by Norbert Wiener. I don't know if I lost the quote. No, here it is. So this is Lévi-Strauss. And in 1950, just shortly after these things had become public in the United States, he wrote this. The most recent developments in the social science give us cause to hope for the progressive mathematization of the field. In certain essential domains, such as that of kinship, the analogy with language, so strongly asserted by most, could enable us to discover the precise rules by which, in any type of society, cycles of reciprocity are formed, whose automatic laws are henceforth known, enabling the use of deductive reasoning in a domain which seems subject to the most total arbitrariness. On the other hand, by associating more and more closely with linguistics, eventually to make a vast science of communications, social anthropology can expect to benefit by the immense prospect opened up to linguistics itself through the application of mathematical reasoning to the study of the phenomena of communication. So there, basically, and in the note, he quotes both Wiener and Weaver and Shannon. So both the engineer and the people who did the math for making communication of data over telephone lines possible. So it's quite amazing because we tend to think of these people as critics, Lévi-Strauss, Lacan, but in fact they were very deeply affected, it turns out, by the cybernetics and by this project to, as it were, mechanize the mind, to make, this is the title of a great book, The History of Science by Jean-Pierre Dupuy, The Mechanization of the Mind. And so Dupuy says, what structuralism, Lacan, the famous structuralist psychoanalyst, what structuralism sought to achieve in the anthropology of Lévi-Strauss, for example, and especially in his studies of systems of exchange in traditional societies, was a subjectless cognition, indeed cognition without mental content, whence the project of casting symbolic thought as a mechanism characteristic not of individual brains, but of unconscious linguistic structures that operate automatically. So cybernetics was also the main topic of Lacan's seminar during the years 54, 55. A very influential seminar, and Watari himself, Felix Watari, was initially studied with Lacan. And this becomes quite interesting when you know that Lacan is fundamentally a structuralist, somebody who's quite close to the logic of cybernetics, and Watari is kind of a wild man, really. Somebody who is very much an activist, cultural revolutionary, an intellectual, sort of a vanguardist intellectual who is deeply involved, first of all, with crazy people, with schizophrenics, and who seeks in his work with schizophrenics ways to denormalize ourselves, the world in general, and to shift people away, not from machines in general, but from specific configurations, rigid configurations, where people are locked into one way of being. Watari and his friend Deleuze were very concerned with inventing aesthetics, with inventing forms, with inventing strategies, and inventing philosophical ideas that did not obey any sort of unifying, centralizing, totalizing, imposed pattern like the pattern of cybernetic reasoning built into the very fabric of urban existence, but instead tried to find ways to twist away from that. And this is why Deleuze and Watari in the 90s, when a lot of contemporary web aesthetics were invented, were sort of the key text, actually. 1,000 Plateaus was really the key text. And in a large sense, it was written against Lacan. That we know, that everybody knows, that Deleuze and Guattari's post-structuralist writing is against the structuralism of Lacan. What everybody has not understood is that behind the structuralism of Lacan, you actually have the major social science of cybernetics and its effects on society as a built fabric, as a set of communication protocols, and so on. And I think that Deleuze and Watari were uniquely aware of how deep-ranging these effects were, how much they existed on a kind of psychic level, and we'll see that their work consists in trying to, as I said before, create human assemblages, sort of human machines with, situations as here where we interact with equipment with each other, who could somehow derail themselves, somehow get themselves out of these mathematized structures that people were building, actually. So to describe a little bit the extent, what it really meant in the post-war period to apply cybernetics, to make it into an applied social science, one which could be applied also to warfare, I want to show you a little clip from this very strange movie, The Net, by a German guy named Lutz Daumbeck. It's actually about, I think, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, LSD, and the internet. Because it's a kind of conspiracy, a very strange movie with some very, very good stuff in it. Interesting to watch, and I'm going to show you a bit of it to introduce you a little bit to Norbert Wiener and what his work might have meant at the time. What sort of applications it might have had. So, here's Wiener. He's actually a local boy. Let me see if we can get the sound here. This is just a few minutes that kind of look into Wiener's biography. Let's see if this works.
In Chicago geborene Mathematiker und Physiker Norbert Wiener sein Wissen für den Abwehrkampf gegen den Faschismus an. Wiener lehrt am MIT als Professor für Mathematik und hat sich schon im Ersten Weltkrieg mit Fragen der Ballistik.
Okay, I'm gonna have to work on this.
Maybe if you just leave it like at this scale.
I think it won't either. I think you have to. Let's see, there's maybe one way to do it. Let's give it a try. Usual computing problems. Let's see if I can get that video to work. Yes, great. Okay, so back to Norbert Wiener, who was born in Chicago, had already worked on ballistics and artillery during World War I.
Wie kann man eine Maschine bauen, die Bewegungen von Jagdfliegern im Voraus berechnet, um diese dann abschießen zu können? Wiener muss dabei das Wesen des technisierten Krieges berücksichtigen, wo Menschen, Schiffe und Flugzeuge auf dem Radarschirm nur mehr abstrakte weiße Punkte und Zeichen sind. Der Pilot verschmilzt mit seiner Maschine, die Grenze zwischen Mensch und Maschine verwischt und es entsteht ein anonymes, mechanisiertes Gegenüber, dessen Handlungen nun in den Kriegslaboratorien modelliert und berechnet werden. Obwohl Wieners Maschinen bis Kriegsende nicht einsetzbar sind, entwickelt er davon ausgehend das Modell einer neuen Wissenschaft, die als Kybernetik bekannt wird. Kybernetik beschäftigt sich mit der Frage, wie Nachrichtenübertragung in Maschinen und Lebewesen funktioniert. Basis der Kybernetik ist die Annahme, dass das menschliche Nervensystem Realität nicht abbildet, sondern errechnet. Der Mensch erscheint nun als ein informationsverarbeitendes System. Das Denken als Datenverarbeitung und das Gehirn als eine Fleischmaschine. Das Gehirn ist nicht mehr der Ort, an dem sich auf geheimnisvolle Art und Weise das Ich und Identität durch Erinnerung und Bewusstsein bildet. Es ist eine Maschine, die aus Schalt- und Regelkreisen, aus Rückkopplungsschleifen und aus Kommunikationsknoten besteht. Eine Blackbox, in der in einem Kreislauf die Ursache Wirkung und die Wirkung Ursache ist. Ein geschlossenes Rückkopplungssystem mit In- und Output, den man kontrollieren und berechnen kann. Nicht mehr wie bisher ausgehend von Naturanschauung, sondern von unbezweifelbarer Mathematik und Logik. Wieners Zukunftsvision von einer kommenden kybernetischen Gesellschaft liefert nun für den neuen politisch-militärischen Status der USA als Supermacht die wissenschaftliche Legitimation. Kybernetik wird zur neuen globalen Leitwissenschaft, die fortan unter wechselnden Etiketten weiterentwickelt wird. Aus einer Theorie wird weltweite Praxis.
I'm quite amazed by this film because the guy goes into all kinds of things and ends up to places as interesting as that one.
this notion that a theory could become worldwide practice. And it's true, because by 1962, you had what the United States called the Worldwide Command and Control Center. So only about 17 years later, when basically they had just developed radar during the war, they got to the point where they had a grid of information transferring machines, actually an early version of something like the internet, hooked up and able to use for directing aircraft, exchanging information about, this was mostly still directly military stuff, anti-aircraft stuff, which is a real driver for machines because it's so fast. In fact, the first digital computer was invented first as a general purpose flight simulator. So what he said about modeling, making models of behavior and then applying them to the world, well, there you can see the computer itself is above all a modeling machine. It's first made to model flight, and of course it's still used to do that extensively, and this is part of the transformation of our world, in fact, that such things can be modeled by computer, and you can learn things without actually leaving the ground in this case. So I think the film is really worth seeing. I'm going to go back to the picture stuff. Let's see if we just come back with this. Yes, more or less. So I think it's really against that you have to understand Deleuze and Guattari. This is Deleuze and Guattari's first book, which was called Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. And they began, with it. This is the frontispiece of the book, Boy with Machine. So they were really interested in the machinic, but they were interested in denormalizing it. They were interested in looking not just at the machine, but also at the difference of the boy. They were interested in looking into the psyche and the physiology of the boy as it's transformed by the machine. And they wanted to do this excessively. They wanted to do this in an anti-authoritarian way that was explicitly against Lacanian structuralism, but which was also against every sort of form of hierarchical power symbolized by the Freudian triangle of the Oedipus complex, basically. And so they produced a book which was really a book of 1968, and was received as such, as the 1968 book that really was a slap in the face of authority and a sort of opening up of a kind of gigantic sort of deconstructive cultural sort of free-for-all, which was really about taking society as it was apart and especially refusing the very authoritarian, disciplinary, military structures that had really become cemented in the Cold War society as a kind of permanent war society where the sort of specter of world war is constantly there to maintain a kind of very rigid kind of discipline, which I don't think really know anything about any longer, because the world has fundamentally changed due to cultural activities like that. Not just this one, of course, but due to the whole snowball of things which there were. And a lot of people in the United States tend to forget about Watari, but there would have been no, even Deleuze would be nowhere near as well known as he was if Watari, the activist and the person involved with schizophrenia, hadn't made this strange assemblage or machine with the philosopher involved with the history of philosophy and the creation of new concepts. So together they made something which is really a strange, unidentified and unidentifiable object, this book, and then their further work, and they really experimented with, well, style for one thing, with that element of literature which can't be modeled out rationally, but which somehow coheres as the meeting of body and symbol. There where the linguistic code is the most embodied and where it becomes ambiguous because of the embodiment. I think that's what they were really going for in this book, like everybody around. And yet, there's probably, now this is something of the air. I just wanted to show you a famous performance really by Jean Tinguely, Homage to New York, done in 1960. Tinguely is a machine sculptor, right? He creates machines, and this is the famous performance where he created a self-destructive machine which I think was very much the imaginary of Watari, along with Carouge and Raymond Roussel, and this whole sort of tradition of the French avant-garde, obsessed and fascinated with machines that play, machines that don't work, machines that do unexpected things, like actually a work of art here which destroys itself. But I think, having said all that, that was 68. You know. This is the book that really interests us in terms of net culture. It's the book, 1,000 Plateaus. And it's, I mean, this is the first, you know, chapter, and it's interesting from the first sentence, you know. They remark that they did it together. And then they say that since each of us was several, there was already quite a crowd. They insist that what they're doing is somehow both a map and a code for the production of something else. By using this thing here, where it resembles a map, you also know that it's a code for the production of music. You see that it has been created by absolutely mixing the disciplines of sort of visionary drawing and the very strict discipline of musical notation. And it's something fantastic that starts out really strong and keeps on unfolding into multiplicity. And that's what they say here at the bottom. To reach not the point where one no longer says I, since we are we and there are many of us, there's a crowd, but to the point where it is no longer of any importance whether one says I. We are no longer ourselves. Each will know his own. We have been aided, inspired, multiplied. So this is the program of 1,000 Plateaus, which is no longer just a destructive program, as Anti-Oedipus was. It's a creative program. It imagines actually 1,000 possible worlds, plateaus of intensity, which arise into being and then dissipate. That's the whole idea. And in fact, the title 1,000 Plateaus is actually a quotation from Gregory Bateson, one of the early cyberneticists in the United States, an English guy, actually, English scientist. Now, I think that between this sort of thing and between, therefore, the Anti-Oedipus and this book, something has really happened. And one of the things that clearly happened was this man, Heinz von Forster, and above all, what he called second-order cybernetics. That is to say, a cybernetics which is no longer the logic of communication and control, developed by engineers, basically, but a discourse that inquires what happens when the person who is describing a social situation is actually part of that situation. So what happens when the observer is part of the observed and the reflective activity of the observer changes what they're observing? You have there a formula for a machinic situation which can change itself, which can alter its own parameters as though it were creating new parts and soldering them or welding them into themselves, as though it was inventing new software, as though it were transforming itself all the time. This, the possibility of thinking like this came from reflective people like Forster, who, as it's noted here in the film again, is a constructivist. That is to say, he thinks that we human beings construct our own reality, even on the level of the way we think. This here again, you see the notation from the Pitts-McCulloch model of neural nets. This is the film is really great. You know, no objective reality exists independent of the observer. So it's all relative, but it's also relative to the guy from the Army standing, or actually the Air Force standing over the shoulder of every smart scientist, especially if they were interested in engineering in the entire Cold War period. And still today, you always have this, this kind of observer, which critically influences the kinds of machines that are created, of course. But I think von Forster is not somebody who's entirely subservient to this sort of thing. He was actually from around here, and if you're interested in it, the biological computer lab was at the University of Illinois in Urbana, Champaign-Urbana, actually. Something, I mean, it's quite a historic thing that's nearby. So you could think that the event which arises, or one of the events which makes the 1,000 Plateaus so interesting and so different from the Anti-Oedipus, is the arrival of second-order cybernetics. This book here is kind of the classic collection of essays on Forster. Here, this is a network which you can't read very well, but that would be Heinz von Forster in red. Here you have someone like Gregory Bateson. Here, Warren McCulloch himself, the man I've been talking about. A bunch of other people, Varela, Francisco Varela, Umberto Maturana. Farther up there is Margaret Mead and many other people who are sort of the network of people who have begun to evolve this self-reflexive cybernetics. And I think you can really inscribe Deleuze and Guattari exactly in that network with their book, whose title is taken from Bateson, after all, huh? Gregory Bateson. Because Gregory Bateson actually went through the whole thing, and although he was there at the founding of cybernetics by the engineers and the mathematicians, he was a naturalist and really always tended towards bringing reflexivity to cybernetics and therefore being part of this second-order cybernetics, as von Forster says. But what I think you really have to ask is, what is the fundamental problem that Deleuze and Guattari faced in their work, 1,000 Plateaus? What were they really trying to get at? What were they really trying to oppose or derail or take apart? And why did that book become so key for artist-activist approaches to the networks in the 1990s, when this thing began to really take off and be open to the use of a lot of artists? So 2 questions. The first one being, what was really their fundamental problem? Well, I think their fundamental problem was still this, actually. Because anyone living in the Cold War could never forget that the use to which technology was being put was fundamentally of the order of the greatest imposition, the worst overcoding imaginable, something that burns into the flesh of humanity, the truth that this stuff is really, really dangerous. And of course, the explosion is connected in everybody's minds to the computer, which at that time is a machine for defense, basically. That's its function at the time. So here is another Boy with Machine series. The boy is J.W. Forrester, an engineer, actually, this guy. He worked in the war. He worked at MIT, worked during the war, you know, on anti-aircraft guns like everybody. Started to develop this enormous computer, which is actually composed of, say, I don't know, 40 or 50 banks like that, one of the earliest digital computers. He actually invented magnetic core memory, so a very important person in the development of computers. So he actually developed this thing, which is actually a surveillance system, the first one, called SAGE, Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, built to massive proportions as a way of convincing the American public that a nuclear attack by the Russians could be detected and stopped. Obsolescent at the moment when it was brought online, widely thought to be merely a device for convincing the American people that they don't need to fear the things that the government was telling them at the same time to fear intensely, and also driver of a huge defense computer industry, which, although these ones didn't really work, they were deployed massively, and it's not really certain that they worked at all. The process of building them really launched the US computer industry. And this SAGE, the first spin-off was IBM, which sold actually airline flight booking machine called Sabre, semi-automatic ticketing, or I forget what it exactly means. Bookkeeping, yes. Anyway, you see the derivation from SAGE, Sabre. It's actually the same machine, the same software and stuff, and it's the first big spin-off into the commercial realm of military development. That goes on since then, and it's now the pattern whereby the American economy runs itself. So I think that this guy, I mean, this leading to this kind of like, you know, mega surveillance sort of image of the world. This is a control room of SAGE with a map of the eastern seaboard of the US. The amazing thing about this guy is he did all that, developed the first digital computer, developed the first huge integrated system leading to the worldwide command and control center. Then he went into private business, and he started to work on modeling the dynamics of industrial processes and trying to see if he could get those inside the computer and do experiments, therefore, on the timing of complex industrial processes, not in the workplace itself, but do them as simulations on the computer, which means planning organization, planning society on a really huge scale. So this guy, I don't know, when he slept, he must have had incredible sort of willpower and a very dangerous sort of guy. One of these guys who really took the military technology and plowed it right into the way that we organize our lives in a normal workplace and industry. And he has a list here of what industrial dynamics should do. And I'm actually going to read this list, which starts out a bit banal and then becomes really interesting. He says that industrial dynamics should provide a basis for the design of more effective industrial and economic systems. So he's thinking really large. Design better economic systems. And industrial dynamics approach to enterprise design progresses through several steps. Identify a problem, obvious. Isolate the factors that appear to interact to create the observed symptoms. Trace the cause and effect information feedback loops that link decisions to action, to resulting information changes, and therefore to new decisions. So all the information feedback and the moments of decision that create new information. Formulate acceptable formal decision policies that describe how decisions result from the available information streams. Now it gets interesting. Construct a mathematical model of the decision policies, information sources, and interactions of the system components. Generate the behavior through time of the system as described by the model, usually with a digital computer to execute the lengthy calculations. Compare results against all pertinent available knowledge about the actual system, the one outside. Revise the model and the one in the computer until it's acceptable as a representation of the actual system. Redesign within the model the organizational relationships and policies which can be altered in the actual system to find the changes which improve system behavior. This is the key thing. Redesign inside the computer the organizational relationships and policies which can be altered in the actual system, and then alter the real system in the directions that model experimentation has shown will lead to improved performance. So this is how theory becomes reality in our day. By computer modeling, trying out a lot of different possibilities in the system, and when the model starts to look good, try and alter the real system so that it works like the computer model. This is the thing which I think Deleuze and Watari deeply opposed. I think this is where they were really heading in all their, at first their sort of more destructive sort of outbursts of the anti-Oedipus, and then in their attempt to constitute, to construct multiplicities, that is to say, active agents which are no longer just an individual who can be triangulated by the axioms of capitalism, but rather unfolding multiplicities or trans-individual sort of constructs, machines, which try to step outside the normalized system of behaviors that are set into place by this sort of modeling and change them. That's what Deleuze and Watari really wanted. The thing about Forster is he didn't stop with industrial dynamics. He went on to urban dynamics. And he started to look at how a city, in fact Chicago was the city, how it was growing, particularly with corporations as the driver. And then it became clear to him that when he makes models of the dynamics of a city, that these complex systems are counterintuitive. That is to say, you have to make the model to see. You can't just guess because the system is so complex that it gives results you don't expect. So one of the unexpected things, one of the indications that suggest corrective action turned out to be that the policies that have been adopted for correcting a difficulty, read the welfare state, because that's what he meant actually, welfare state program, are actually intensifying it rather than producing a solution. So this guy, in addition to all the other things he does, was also part of the great anti-welfare thrust of the late 60s and then was leading on to Reagan and all that. Rationalize, rationalize, rationalize. Use a computer to create models of more efficient behavior. When the computer looks very good, then change the material reality so that it starts to look like the computer. Get rid of unemployment. Get rid of all the things that would attract people to want to stay sort of immobile and not find work. Make the economy more liquid, more rapid, and you get to situations that look so good in the computer, situations like this. Situations where you know where every stream of energy, where every product stream, where every financial stream is going, and where you can start to coordinate them so that they don't exhibit these counter sort of internal contradictions like the graph that we see there. Start planning out, in this case for industrial design, not only how you're most effectively going to accomplish the production circuit going to the public, but also understand when you inject advertising into the system, what it will do to the prospective purchases, as they say, of the public. How to make the timing of all that come together is what Forrester was really trying to do. How to make it cohere, how to make it, as I said before, centralized, hierarchized, functionalized, unified. In other words, how to overcode human activity with an algorithmic rule that makes it more productive according to the interest of the person in the driver's seat. A very, very strong social program. And so this is overcoding not only as build form, but also as informational rhythm. Sort of those key terms here: centering, unification, totalization, integration, hierarchization, and finalization. So the axiomatic processes of capitalism. So when you understand those things, you can probably have more of a taste for the Deleuze and Guattari's notion of the war machine, which is here represented by a simple drawing of a Mongol chariot, which was the great invention of the nomads, which allowed them to sweep across Central Asia in the early centuries of the first millennium, actually the later centuries of the first millennium. And so they go into a whole thing about this, about nomadism, war machines, which should be understood as actually as abstract machines, which are projections which allow you to see what can happen, models of a reality that actually unfolds in time. Their models, they want not only to be dynamic, they want them to produce multiplicities rather than centered, hierarchized, unified social forms. They want to experiment really with a kind of something that doesn't really involve order, that rather involves the multiplication of possibilities and the openness to virtualities, that is to say, possible realities which are there as possibilities but haven't been expressed, haven't been made into actualities. So this whole relation between the virtual, the possible, and the actual. They're very, very interested in that, against this sort of very tight and rigorous kind of planning that you have in this cybernetic type society. So, but Deleuze and Guattari don't simply want to create a different kind of Forrester. I mean, they don't want to have a model like this that's very one-dimensional. It's all having to do with logic and the flow of goods at measurable speeds. They want to have something much more complex, as expressed by the title of this chapter: becoming intense, becoming animal, becoming imperceptible. So in their models of how people organize, of how people come together and work with each other, of how people achieve expression, there's not just a rationalized sort of time, cost-efficient sort of logic. There's rather a logic of going from measurable quantities to qualities, intense, of something which is pathic, which is sensible, which is perhaps not linguistic, which is animal, and also a way of disappearing from the system, becoming imperceptible, actually leaving, actually exiting somehow from this cybernetic society. And in the territory and in the universes of reference, there's a subjective side, and that the expressive side, the objective social side, is here. You can also think that this side is the ground, actuality, and this side is possibility, potential, virtuality, and also the direction of deterritorialization, leaving the territory, leaving the ground. This is going to get a little more concrete very soon. It begins on a territory. Deleuze and Guattari studied animals a lot, ethology. They thought about what it is to have a territory with which you're familiar, territory appears as a cutout from all the other territories. It's the one in which you are, and in which you are in a relation to some things which are incorporeal. That is to say, images, music, patterns, things which you remember and which come back to you as a kind of refrain. You hear them again, and then you hear them again. You hear them, you feel them as you move in this territory. In fact, this relation here is what Watari thinks of as the pathic relation. Pathos, passion. That is to say, a kind of, this is before talking. Even though there may be poetry in these incorporeal universes, songs, even though you may imagine all kinds of things that have voices, you are nonetheless in a kind of loop which is mute, which coheres in the experience of the territory, which is really subjective. And as I said, pathic, which is based on a core of sensibility or feeling. Tries to describe that before enlarging the system and including then all the things which through various kinds of expenditures of energy bring a person or a number of people into relation with others and into relation with equipment. So he lists flows, economy of flows, and he speaks of libido, signifier, capital, labor. What he means is that any kind of organization, any kind of project, any kind of mobile, sort of like a circus on wheels, if you will, could be this. But it could also be this school that we're in. It could be every type of concatenation that achieves some kind of coherentness and actually gives a social expression to these, the territorial experience of those who take part in it and who are changed thereby, who are deterritorialized by taking part in this new thing. Then the last thing, which completes the square, is what Watari calls machinic phylums, and by that he means really code. He means abstract machines. He means discourses, such as the discourses of science, but also of law, of philosophy, of linguistics. Every kind of expression which becomes not only is objective, but is continually changing in a kind of, along a kind of phylum, as a kind of branch, like we think of law as being one thing and science as being another thing. And then within science, there are all those different branches that continually, ramify. And the thing about science is it never stops. It goes on forever. So it's always deterritorializing the actual economy of flows. The actual thing that you're doing, like the way that our lives have changed with the introduction of all this equipment that wasn't here just 15 years ago, the way it continually changes with the new devices, but also with the new ideas that people have, because it's not just about science, it's also, can also be religion, can also go in this upper corner. So this, the point of this is to try to think about another mapping out of what coheres to make an event, to make something happen, and try to think of it as an abnormalizing one, as one that's devoted to becoming other, as one that's devoted to this sort of twisting away movement, which is an artistic strategy, but also an intellectual and political strategy of subversion. That's why people were so interested in this, because the idea was to subvert. And you've got to realize that this book was achieving its greatest prominence while the internet was coming together. So the internet, which came directly out of military technology, and which, as we know, has the possibility and to some extent is a vast surveillance machine, can also be denormalized if people make the effort. And so a lot of people were fascinated with Deleuze and Guattari during the 90s and still to this day, because the internet seemed to show, like other social situations, that if you grab hold of it, you can actually twist it and change it, make it into something else, throw it off track, create multiplicities which are also, which can't be pinned down because they dissolve and they become something else. The way this whole system, as the point here is not to find out what things are, but rather to identify how things are moving and to see how they produce new statements, which in turn, again, change the way that people feel on their territories. So the point of this thing is actually to start mapping out the complexity of a life which cannot all be captured in mathematics, but where there's also room for mathematics. I mean, it doesn't exclude, it's not a, it's not one of these. The great thing about Deleuze and Guattari is they're not afraid of science, which is kind of rare on the left, actually. So This is Watari's idea. It's his book, Schizoanalytic Cartographies. And it would be very interesting to map out how some of the subversive internet projects were actually done, and maybe to use this kind of structure to see, what kind of references people had, not only where they were living, but what kind of, psychic relation they had to that spot of living, what kind of groups they were involved in, and what kind of discourses influenced the bifurcations of different projects. And so you could look at software projects. You could look at big things like the digital city in Amsterdam or in Berlin, which were major things. You could look at the way a laboratory like Bell Labs or MIT developed, and you would be able to use this model to inquire into the different bifurcations of the way these things developed. And it's particularly interesting when there are people a bit, rebellious involved. What I want to show you is rather a different use of the cartography that is actually related to the internet, to the extent that this has to do with the development of the anti-globalization movement, which would have never developed without the internet. So what I've done is actually think over the way that I sort of left my territory and became part of a big social movement which itself continually changed for a period of really almost 10 years, because these pictures here represent the experience of the street, the territory of the street, the political street in Paris in the mid-90s. This part here, which should give an indication of the imaginaries, in effect, drawn from some artists at the time who were transforming the way that we occupied the street. We at the time was involved in a seminar, which by looking at very interesting artists like Oyvind Fellström, invented some new ideas, and out of that actually came a new way of occupying the street, which I'm not going to go into here, but this is actually a sort of huge exhibition gallery which you can push along the street and open up to show people directly out in the street. So it represents, from this kind of street graphic-oriented art group working with unemployed people, this represents a way of injecting information into the great moving machine of a demonstration, which is not generally a place where tracks circulate, but where complex information does not. What was done with this thing is that all kinds of complex information was put on the inner walls of this. I'm not going to show you in detail, because I'm actually going to show you how these cartographies changed. This is basically represents a moment in London in 1999, when the kinds of struggles that were being proposed here in a totally French context. You had this is the Place de la République. I mean, it's the whole thing of liberty, equality, fraternity. It's the national context. Within about 3 or 4 years, the social movement looked a lot more like this. It could take place in a city like London. That you would be in the territory of a kind of a very playful street where people were opening up the fire hydrants to dance around in. You would be inspired most strikingly by Subcomandante Marcos, a voice from Latin America, from an entirely different reality. The machine became this summit hopping machine to actually appear in the middle of developed cities and to protest against financial globalization. And what seemed to drive that on were all kinds of things connected to the internet, including the fact that you could have demonstrations in 40 countries or 70 countries, I think, on that day, on a single day, and that you could make it known through this software here is actually the first use in Australia after June 18th, 1999, of what became the Indie Media software. So this cartography here tries to gather a territory, a universe of reference, a concrete form of organization, and the sophisticated discourses that transform continually that form of organization and indeed the whole thing. I could show a few more of these. This is it's really the same map. I mean, it's just a different place. We're in Quebec. That's actually me, the art critic. This is the image that was really produced that day. Well, I actually took that image, but it also existed in everyone's minds, an image of taking this fence down. This was the social machine I was involved in at that time, was able to distribute 200 kilograms of posters, stickers, and all that for the demonstration at our opening. So this was the machine of the opening, which is actually used to distribute all this stuff that people would use the next day. And we also distributed 3,000 of these masks that we made on the site. So we had well, I was very involved with street artists at the time, as usual. But there was also this whole intellectual side, which is the so-called Counter Summit Properly Speaking, here, the second People's Summit of the Americas, from which very advanced ideas came out. And these, so I try to represent the 4 parts of the map in this thing. You can you know, sketch that out, and you get a kind of map of what was happening, always divided into territory, universes of reference, flows, and machinic phylums. Don't worry, I'm not going to go on too long with this. This is just this was a moment when it looked really good because of the huge demonstration in Geneva. Very interesting things happening. Very strong inspiration coming from Latin America and the beginnings of the World Social Forum movement. Very interesting work being done by activists to transform our notion of the nation state and think about a civilization without borders. And yet a kind of transformation that happens as things are unfolding, because of course you get a situation where the territory looks very bad, where there's serious problems in the organization of the machine, where the old sources of information producing, you know, come back in to really dominate with, well, obviously quite incendiary situations, and all of that just a few days before basically all of us in the movement found ourselves in a really strange situation where the territory seemed to be ground zero, but the great reference of everybody was Argentina, where there had just been what looked like a popular revolution. So in the north you had this, in the south you had this. Actually, on the street, people were still carrying on the whole reclaim the streets thing, street parties, all of that. But what we were focusing on intellectually was much more the surveillance society emerging directly, well, revealing its potentials after this sort of dramatic and legitimizing event of September 11th. So that's just like something like, actually this is the moment where that whole initial sort of cartography that seemed to work really well from about this point onward, this is the moment where it starts not to work, and this is the moment where its parts are separating. Watari says that the different elements of his map, they can be all together or they can be all apart. Everything can cohere or everything can be in fragments, and all the ranges in between, because this is how human real transformation in the new takes place. The new takes place when the old falls apart, you know? And that means that you're not always involved in the same kind of flows, and you don't always feel the same sort of ground beneath your feet. And I know for myself that this was a period of transformation which is related, you know, to the whole machinic surround of post-September 11th society, of the really coming to grips with the fact that we have a kind of world government, basically installed by our government and the English, but without legitimacy. You have, you know, worldwide surveillance systems, worldwide armies, a worldwide economy, but no worldwide democracy. A situation that has been taken a long time for a lot of people to face, and resulted in this kind of confused looking thing, and actually resulted in a kind of a moment where these sort of movements have actually sort of lost some steam, because they need to reanalyze reality. They need to create new knowledge and new poetry also to try and come to grips with the new sort of mega reality that has been building up since September 11th and since the beginning of the Middle Eastern wars. So I'm almost done here. These are just a few images to show how you can shift perhaps towards the kind of thing that this is what I'm involved in now. A very mobile sort of territory, an imaginary of experimental art and communication. That's actually a castle in southern Spain, which is in touch with another castle in Latvia. Both are occupied by, you know, hackers and media activists. And I didn't have time to put a better photo, but we have been carrying out a program in New York called Continental Drift, which is actually dedicated towards trying to understand some of the complexities of these sort of confused cartographies of the day. So the big thing that I would like, to end on, this is all being quite just a bit of an introduction, is a question. And at this point, you know, either I've convinced you or I've not, but maybe there was something interesting happening in the 80s, in the 90s around Deleuze and Watari that really was an interesting artistic possibility to come to grips with a way of thinking which is also a way of social control. Most people think that the agitation of 1968 and the 70s really did something to the way of thinking in our societies, and that the society, the network society, is somehow quite different than the society of the post-war period, the society that really fits with our ideas of cybernetics, of the massive computer systems, all that. But what I think is happening, I'm not sure that one can just use the models of those times, and I'm also not sure that this notion, Watari's notion, that the essential pathic sort of self-reference of this subjective side of his cartography is exactly in the same position as it was 30 or 40 years ago, and I'm going to show you why. Because unfortunately, the people in the military never sleep, and they have lots of scientists working on them. So they're really interested now in converging technologies. And what they want to get at is what they call sociotech, or predictive social science. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to take all these disciplines which study you first on your infracellular level, molecular and submolecular level, genomics, cellular biology, then that study your physiology, then that study psychology, the individual, cognition, learning, then social organization, then cultural and values, and finally the actual sort of the domain of geography, the environment. They want to organize and hierarchize all that so that they can gain more precise knowledge of exactly who you are. You know, homing in on each one of you if necessary for your job, because you're a suspect person, because you're a kid, because you're a talented individual, whatever, and trying to achieve a way of predicting even what's happening at the very center of you, maybe what could be thought of as the core reality of cellular biology and physiology. All these attempts to intervene in that fraction of a second when we start to react before we even know what we're doing. Because that's the big window that this sort of intervention looks for. And so this clearly represents, I think, a threat to society on the magnitude of the one that appeared during the Cold War, when technology and its order, its structure of thinking seemed to hang so heavy on people. It's so heavy that it required a tremendous sort of awakening of the artistic vanguards and finally a kind of cultural revolution to try and shake off some of that imposed order. Now we see a new kind of order appearing, which this time aims deliberately at the pathic element of existence, at the pure sensible being, and so on, and tries to organize it into this hierarchy which would get over the famous divide between the two cultures and really collapse them into one culture usable by the military. So this is what, let's say, they are thinking of today, and I think that the strategies, the incredible strategy of something like 1,000 Plateaus, which sought to destabilize the whole territory of existence and also the way of thinking, the creation of the machinic phyla, you know, of the disciplines of the abstract thought, and the way of organizing yourself, giving rise to this kind of, you know, thing which I was portraying here, which is very much a kind of, you know, Deleuzian, Deleuzo-Guattarian form of organization. You know, what I'm wondering is, don't we need to invent entirely new things now, if in fact the reality and the kinds of models that are going to be imposed on us are going through a whole new phase of development by the people with the techno-scientific power? So this, for me, is a way of studying to get ready to do more things in life, and not necessarily things that go in the direction of making us into targets, because that's what this shape is obviously about. Okay, well, that was pretty much what I had to say. Kind of experimental, probably very abstract, and so now if you have some questions. or some comments on all that, would be great.
It might be filtering in.
It always takes a minute. You have to.
It's a little overwhelming.
Yeah, you have to just let it ride.
Can you derive or inherit from what's overcoded you without fully becoming the overcoded byproduct?
Well, it's the whole question, isn't it? I mean,
You integrate capitalism without being a capitalist.
can you say that more clearly?
Can you integrate aspects of capitalism without being fully a capitalist?
Well, I think that's the thing. I think Watari was anything but a purist. He was really interested in what is, you know? So when he points to this economy of flows, he puts libido, the sexual energy, right next to money, economic energy, you know? He tends to think that people have a kind of relative autonomy that they get as they twist away from something to which they're nonetheless connected. I mean, it's very difficult to go around and find non-capitalist societies right now, you know? It's also very disheartening when you just think, well, I just have to be controlled, you know? So this is a thinking which accepts the extreme sort of force of which the dominant codes exert on people, and at the same time looks at how people twist those ones. And I mean, you could study very interestingly with that fourfold arrangement. You could very interestingly study something like the free software movements, the emergence of SourceForge, everything that's coming out of there. If you look at that over 15 or 20 years and try and think about the territories, the references, the organizations, and the changing codes, you'd see a kind of close fight with capitalism. You know, it's so it's a very impure thing. There's red hat on one side, and there's really serious free software people who wouldn't touch anything commercial ever. And they're together and they collaborate, and of course it goes through changes depending on the environment, that is to say the regulatory environment, the police environment, but also the enthusiasm of people doing it, the kinds of formations they're able to invent, the new technologies, all that. So yeah, I think the impurity thing is much more interesting. It's much more real too.
If all these things are like integratable into like this like alternate way of sort of being, like what's the filtering system? Like what's like a reasonable filtering system that people can use for creating sort of like a moral like feasibility, a feasibly moral existence that integrates things which are potentially.
Yeah, if you take this their sort of account on board, then you're thinking that the world is basically a lot of minorities, right? Because there are different sorts of groupings, different sorts of constellations which come together. And this sort of mapping it shows you a multiplicity. It doesn't show you one model and then everyone, for instance, agreeing that that model is ethical, just, and therefore good, right? So you're not seeing a unified society. You're seeing a kind of patchwork. So the big question is, what sort of groupings do you get involved with? You know, it's expressed in a simple way. What classes do you take? That's a very simple way, you know. Or who do you get married with, you know? Or what? But then it's what sort of artist group do you work with? In which city, you know? Headed in which direction? So it becomes a thing where really the individual and the group have to figure out their ethics in relation to a wider world which can't be trusted to do it for you. That's the way I feel about society myself. I mean, when I look at it, I share this world with these people who want to spend, billions of dollars, which is actually our money, on producing machines to control us. I can't feel like there's a unified ethics in society. I have to try and invent an ethics in the different assemblages that I become involved in, or indeed I'm caught up in by the force of, by the sort of turbulent flow of change in the world. And so the place of, very interestingly for Watari, I can show you, so I can go a little further with that and in his direction rather than just mine.
Have you ever changed in a natural disaster kind of way, or something brought about like through social change?
Well, yeah, exactly. It goes with her question. His idea was really, what interested him was that through this whole process of becoming, you know, deterritorializing yourself, becoming other, of sort of getting out of your sort of pathic, you know, sensible relation to a territory and joining a experimental situation which itself is changed by the effects generated by different kinds of codes. What he was really interested in was that a group should achieve the capacity of expression. In other words, that they should be able to take stock of their own situation, how they're working in with respect to the other, say, dominant cartography, or with respect to other groups around them, and be able to create a statement, which isn't just a repetition, which isn't just saying what's already been said, what you've been told to say, or what's available there already to say, but creating a new statement. So the moment of ethical practice is when that new statement is made, because it then has effects, even on the way we feel, even on our unconscious relationship to life. So there's that's the ethical moment in the way that Watari conceived this. And yes, other diagrams which are more complex would show you the feedback relations within this thing, because it's it's basically second order cybernetics. It's a situation where you have feedback leading to phase changes, you know, where the system starts to change its basic parameters, and then at a critical moment it sort of explodes and becomes something quite different. It's a model of, it's like a reflection, you know, here in 2 dimensions of something that happens in 4. Again, to go back to Duchamp's idea, processes that change in time. That's what we're getting at. And the whole question is, can we interfere consciously with our, not just with our thoughts, but with statements and collective statements in those processes as they unfold in time? That's the question that Watari was most interested in, because he was always interested in politics, actually, and always wanted to intervene politically, not just himself as a kind of intellectual, but with people who worked in a group. And therefore Watari did pirate radio stuff. He did some of the first billboards in Europe using the very beginnings of internet technology. He was always there when media was changing. Video he used a lot. Very interesting guy for experimentation, but always with this political angle of trying to achieve that capacity where a group has become autonomous enough to make a statement of its own, to make an original statement that then actually reflects on that and tries to change the very parameters within which everyone is evolving.
Okay, well, I know that some of you probably need to leave or may need to leave. Before you do, I just wanted to take a moment again to thank Brian for this incredible presentation.